New WBUR poll out of New Hampshire shows Bernie Sanders up at the top, and for the first time, he has a double-digit lead over the other candidates. So let's really break down the poll, really take a look at the numbers. So you can see here, this has a sample size of 426 likely voters. So, it's a good, solid poll. I'd be lying to you if I said that this was the highest quality poll that we've seen out of New Hampshire. But for a state like New Hampshire, a sort of smaller state, that is a decent and respectable sample size. So it is like it's a legitimate poll. So first, when it comes to the numbers, when it comes to favorability, let me zoom it out just a little bit so we can have a better grip here. So when it comes to favorabilities, as to be expected, we have Bernie Sanders up at the top in terms of favorability with 74 and 18. That's a 56 and net favorability of 56%. In second place, when it comes to favorability, we have 61 and 17 for Andrew Yang. So that's a net favorability of 44%. So you can see Bernie Sanders really does have quite a significant jump in terms of favorability over the second place. Third place, believe it or not, we have Mayor Pete Buttigieg, or I guess former mayor at this point, 62% and 21. So that's I think 41% net favorability. And then in fourth place here, we have Elizabeth Warren. Where is she? There she is, 60% and 29% with a net favorability of 31%. And then in fifth place, actually, I suppose tied with Elizabeth Warren, we have Amy Klobuchar at 49 and 18 for a net favorability of 31%. And I will say, that is not good news for Elizabeth Warren to have net favorabilities equal to Amy Klobuchar. That is, that's not where you want to be. But even worse than that, we have Joe Biden all the way down at number 6 in terms of net favorability at 57 and 32% unfavorability for a net favorability of 25. That is, those are real, just keeping it real, those are very bad numbers for Joe Biden when it comes to favorability. Now, I will just say real quick, Tulsi Gabbard at 28 and 37, she is underwater at -9% in favorability. But so now let's take a quick look at the numbers themselves when it comes to the actual poll. So Bernie Sanders, like I said, up at the top here. Where is he? There he is at 15% last time, and then now 29%. That's a 14-point gain. Absolutely enormous. And he really is head over, he really is way over the top when it comes to the numbers. We have Joe Biden at 14%. And 17% last time. So Joe Biden has dropped. Now, Elizabeth Warren has gone up a point in the poll from December. So she had 12% in December and now at 13%. And you can really see these numbers here. Andrew Yang staying steady at 5%. Pete Buttigieg dropping a point from 18 to 17. And when you go into some of these numbers here, when it comes to what the voters really care about, the main thing that I wanted to discuss here is how anti-Trump here at 6%. So if Democrats think that they can win the election by just coming around and touting how anti-Trump they are, they have another thing coming that's not going to ultimately sway it. Voters still ultimately care significantly about policy, health care and drug prices, Medicare for all being the number one top issue. I'm pretty sure that has to do significantly with why Bernie Sanders has seen his surge so significantly. If voters are most concerned about healthcare, when it comes to healthcare, Bernie Sanders seems to be the issue, the candidate sort of leading the charge with that issue. On the issue of environment, climate change, second place at 34%, economy and jobs at 20%, education, student loans 16, social justice 11, foreign policy and relations at 11. And I will say this is somewhat indicative when it comes to the national things. Joe Biden, we've seen, has been trying to tout his sort of for a while there, was trying to tout the whole foreign policy thing, which is why Bernie Sanders was trying to criticize him on, foreign policy, saying that he, sort of lacks judgment on the claim. hitting him, for instance, on the Iraq war vote, etc. But overall, we have seen that foreign policy is not the highest consideration for voters, as it sort of normally is not. So Joe Biden trying to come around and talk about foreign policy and, sort of tout how experienced, how he's, this experienced statesman probably will not have the effect that he wants to have. So that's really the main thing that I want to talk about when it comes to this poll itself. Now, I do just want to, sort of warrant some caution, because this poll obviously is kind of an outlier, because Bernie Sanders, he does have a 12-point lead over second place when it comes to this poll. But in the other polls, Sanders has been, here he was +1 and then +5. So, obviously Bernie Sanders is still in the RCP lead when it comes to New Hampshire. But that poll there is kind of an outlier. So, don't take too much stock into it. We always want to look at the, sort of aggregates of the polls. Now, but the other thing I do just want to quickly discuss is the whole impeachment debate. Because right now, as progressives, we're having a bit of a back and forth, a sort of internal debate right now over whether or not impeachment is going to help or hurt Bernie Sanders in the primary. And there's sort of two general approaches to, sort of two schools of thought. On the one hand, there's sort of the one approach sort of represented by David Dole, so over at Rational National, who thinks that impeachment is ultimately going to help Bernie Sanders because they won't be attacking him in the media. So all the coverage is going to be consumed on impeachment, and so they're not going to be helping, or they won't be attacking Bernie Sanders, and that's going to help him, since really when it comes to Iowa, New Hampshire, et cetera, it's really about the ground game. It's not really about making massive rallies in order to get people out to vote. And so as a result, the fact that the media won't be, focusing their attention attacking Bernie, it's ultimately going to turn around and help him. On the other hand, there's other progressives who argue actually it's going to hurt Bernie Sanders because, they won't be covering him in the media. It'll be sort of like when the media was ignoring him in, kind of in the fall time, because you'll remember there was essentially like basically a Bernie blackout was the hashtag for a very long time, where the media just really wasn't talking about Bernie Sanders. They'd, run segments talking about the race and then just not mention Bernie Sanders. And that was a time when Bernie Sanders was really down in the polls. And so those, progressives who hold this view will turn around, this view of media coverage will turn around and say, actually, it's going to hurt Bernie Sanders because they won't be covering him in the media. Certainly counter to the first position, which, sort of represented by David Dole, we have seen more recently in the media, as they've come around and been attacking Bernie Sanders, really since the new year. Bernie Sanders has been rising in the polls at the same time. Now, obviously, correlation doesn't imply causation. And, sort of in response, the one school of thought will turn around and say, well, actually, the reason why those attacks have been helping Bernie Sanders is because those are really sensational attacks, right? So we've really seen two essential major attacks. We've seen the sort of Bernie Warren kind of back and forth kind of sexist smear. And then the second attack was sort of from Hillary Clinton, where Hillary Clinton comes around and says that nobody likes Bernie Sanders. Those are two kind of sensational attacks. And those are the kinds of attacks which will ultimately help him, right? Because the underlying assumption, you'll notice, the underlying assumption of the view that that impeachment is going to help Bernie Sanders because the media won't be attacking him, the underlying assumption is that it runs a little bit counter to one of the major talking points on the left, one of the major talking points of progressives, which is that when the media attacks Bernie, when the media smears Bernie Sanders, since the media doesn't have any kind of legitimate substantive criticisms, when the media attacks him, it ultimately turns around and helps him. So really, that's kind of the intellectual clash going on in the debate when it comes to impeachment. It's a debate over how media coverage affects a candidate. So it's actually, I don't know, I find it a little bit interesting. Now, what's my view? Well, I actually think, notice the underlying assumption underneath both views, right? The underlying assumption is that the media will incessantly be attacking Bernie Sanders regardless. And there's really good reason to think this, namely that, corporate media is corporate media. And obviously Bernie Sanders represents an existential threat to corporate media and sort of the powerful, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a really good take. But notice, however, that the entire idea of gaining momentum in the first place, the entire idea of, you win Iowa, you win New Hampshire, you win Nevada, and then you have momentum going into Super Tuesday. That entire idea revolves around the idea of, developing a media narrative and developing momentum through that media narrative. So if you ask me, I actually think that the sort of back and forth between progressives right now over whether or not Bernie Sanders is going to be helped or hurt by impeachment is slightly missing the. It's not wrong, but it's asking the wrong question to some extent, right? Because to a large extent, the debate is that's being had is whether or not Bernie Sanders is going to be helped or hurt in particular states. I think instead we should be debating over whether or not the lack of media coverage from the impeachment is ultimately going to help or hurt Bernie Sanders when it comes to developing a media narrative going into Super Tuesday. Because I actually do agree with, sort of David Dole when he says that when it comes to winning Iowa, winning New Hampshire and the like, it's really about the kind of ground game. And developing a strong ground game and getting voters out. So it's not necessarily about the kind of media coverage and the like. But I do think, by the converse, when it comes to Super Tuesday, it really is about getting that narrative, getting that media coverage, because you can't have a strong ground game on, in all of those states at once. It would be astronomically expensive. And so the media narrative becomes more important as we go into Super Tuesday. So my take on it is I actually do think that, yes, it could hurt Bernie Sanders, but we are seeing, a lot of evidence that both Republicans and a lot of Democrats right now are kind of talking about how they want a short and quick trial, so it might not last all the way up to Super Tuesday. So when it comes to the point of media narrative, I'm sort of more optimistic. I'm sort of more optimistic that the trial will be over, hopefully, and it won't hurt Bernie Sanders in that way. But the other thing, though, is did we really expect that? Did we really expect in the first place for the media to turn around if Bernie wins Iowa, New Hampshire, and then even Nevada? Did we really expect the media to turn around and be like, oh yeah, Bernie Sanders, he's definitely going to win. Look at this great, look at this great and inevitable momentum which he has. I'm not entirely sold that we were ever going to see that from the media. So, I think that it could go either way, but I lean towards suggesting that it could hurt Bernie Sanders if the trial is long. So anyway, that's the video. If you liked it, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.